You want to know the thing nobody in Sabino ever said out loud? We all saw the marks. 4 of them laid across her cheekbone like somebody had signed their name in her skin, and not one of us, not the smith, not the preacher's wife, not me, standing close enough to smell the coffee still on her apron, not one of us said a single word. That's the part I carry. Because a bruise on a woman's face isn't a secret. It's a question the whole town decides, all at once and without a vote, whether it wants to answer. And Sabino had already made up its mind about that woman before the sun came up on any of it. She cooked our food and swept our porches, and we called her Lupe because her real name sat funny in our mouths. And when we saw those 4 finger marks, we did what towns do. We looked away. All of us but one man. And what that man did next, quiet as a snapped thread, is the reason I still keep the little book in my breast pocket to this day. The one where I write down what a thing costs and who paid it. I've been keeping that tally most of my life. I thought I understood debts. I didn't understand a thing until I watched him settle that one. So sit. This'll take a while and some of it'll sit wrong in you, and it should. But if you've got the stomach for a true thing told slow, I'll tell you about the morning I found finger marks on a cook's cheek, and about the terrible, tender, dead quiet way the whole reckoning came due. The hens knew before I did. I remember that. 6 o'clock, the light still the color of skimmed milk over the rinkins, and the hens were carrying on in the yard like a fox had gotten in among them, that high, tearing racket that puts a knot in your gut before your brain's even awake enough to name it. I came out of the bunkhouse pulling my second suspender up over my shoulder, half a boot on, cussing the birds under my breath, and I stopped on the step because the racket wasn't foxes. It was the kitchen door standing open, and it was quiet inside, quiet in a wrong way, the kind of quiet that's got weight to it. Now I'll tell you about myself so you know who's talking. My name is Elias Wren, and in the year I'm speaking of I was 34, a hand on the coal ranch outside Sabino in the territory, and I had a habit that men laughed at. I kept a little book, ledger-sized notions in a hand-sized cover. Anything a man owed me, 2 bits, a day's labor, a favor, went down on the left. Anything I owed went on the right. I've been doing it since I was a boy, since my father died owing money to half the county, and I watched those men come pick our house apart board by board while my mother stood in the yard with nothing written down anywhere to say what was fair. After that, I wrote everything down. I told myself it was so I'd never be cheated. The truth, which took me a lot of years to admit, is that I wrote things down so the world would have to be even, so that somewhere, if only in my pocket, the sums would come out right. They almost never do, but a man keeps his habits. They're the last things to leave him. Anyhow, the kitchen door and the wrong quiet and me standing there with one boot half on. I went in. She was at the table. Lupe. She was standing with both hands flat on the boards, the way you brace when the floor's tilting under you and only you can feel it, and her back was to me. And I said her name, the name we'd given her, I mean, and she went stiff as a fence post, but she didn't turn. "Coffee's on," she said. Her voice was fine. That's what I remember thinking. Her voice was completely fine, level as still water, and it was the first thing that scared me, because a voice that calm is a voice doing a great deal of work. "You all right?" "Coffee's on, Mr. Wren." I should have left it. I want you to understand that in that moment, 99 mornings out of 100, I'd have taken my coffee and gone. That was the arrangement. She fed us and we ate, and nobody asked her a single thing about herself, because she was Apache, and there'd been trouble in the territory that most folks in Sabino would never forgive and could never say plain. And so we had all agreed, without ever agreeing, that the woman who cooked our meals was a pair of hands and nothing else. But the hens were still screaming, and she wouldn't turn around. So I walked around the end of the table to get my cup off the hook, and that's how I came to be looking at her when the light from the window fell across her face. 4 marks, high on the left cheek, curving back toward her ear, already darkening at the edges the way a bruise does when it's got some hours on it. You could count the fingers. You could tell it was a right hand, which meant whoever laid it on her had been standing more or less where I was standing, close, facing her, and had brought his arm across her with everything he had, because it takes force to leave marks that clean. A slap that stings and fades doesn't sign its name. This one had. I have been in fights. I have been kicked by horses and thrown into fence rails, and once shot through the meat of the arm by a drunk over a card I never even played. And I am telling you that the thing that happened in my chest when I saw those 4 marks was worse than any of it, because it wasn't pain, it was shame. And shame is the only wound that gets deeper the longer you look at it. Who? I said. It came out of me flat, not even a question really, just the one word set down like a stone. And Lupe turned her head then, finally, and looked at me full on with those marks in the morning light. And what was in her face wasn't fear and it wasn't grief. It was patience. The awful, bone-deep patience of a person who has learned that telling the truth to the likes of me has never once, not one time in her whole life, made her life better. "You'll want your coffee," she said, "before the boss comes down." Josiah Cole. I have to tell you about him, and I have to do it careful, because everything that comes after turns on the kind of man he was, and the kind of man he was is not the kind you'd guess from the front of him. Cole was 60 that year, a widower, and he ran the biggest spread inside a day's ride of Sabino. He'd come out to the territory as a young man with a wife and a Bible and a great deal of certainty, and the country had taken the wife off him with a fever in the second winter and had chipped away at the certainty every year since. The way wind takes a rock, so slow you'd swear it was permanent right up until it wasn't. By the time I knew him, he was a lean, gray, closed-up sort of man who said maybe 200 words in a day and made every one of them count. He paid fair. He worked harder than any hand he hired, which shamed us into working harder too, which I suppose was the point. He went to the Sabino church every Sunday and sat in the third pew and put money in the plate and never, that I saw, seemed to take one lick of comfort from any of it. Folks in town respected him. That's a particular thing, respect without warmth. They respected him the way you respect a deep well, glad it's there, careful near the edge, not inclined to lean in and look. And here is the thing the town knew about Josiah Cole, the thing that made what happened later so hard for Sabino to swallow. Cole had hired an Apache woman to cook in his house. He'd done it 3 years back, and the town had never forgiven him for it, and they'd never said so to his face, because you didn't say things to Cole's face. But it sat under everything. A man had died in the Sabino country in the Troubles, more than one man, but there was one in particular, a rancher named Harmon that half the town had grown up with, and the general feeling, never spoken, always present, was that Cole taking an Apache into his kitchen was a kind of insult to Harmon's memory, to all their memories, as though grief were a debt and Cole had refused to pay his share of it. I didn't know then how Lupe had come to work for Cole. I found out later, and I'll tell you, because it matters. But that morning all I knew was that she was in his kitchen with 4 fingers printed on her face, and she was more worried about him seeing it than she was about her own hurt, and I could not, standing there, make those 2 facts fit together. "He do this?" I asked her, low. Something moved across her face. I couldn't read it, and she said, "No," and it was the first thing she'd said that I believed completely. "Then who?" "Drink your coffee, Mr. Wren." And she turned back to the stove, and the set of her shoulders told me the conversation was closed, bolted, and the key thrown down a well. So I took my coffee out to the porch, and I stood there in the milk-white morning with the hens finally quieting down, and I did the coward's arithmetic. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself she'd said no when I asked if it was Cole, so whatever it was between her and whoever. And a hand doesn't go poking into the private trouble of the house he works for. I told myself all the things a man tells himself when he's decided to look away and needs the decision dressed up as wisdom. And then Cole came down. I heard his boots on the stairs, that even unhurried tread of his, and I heard him say good morning to Lupe the way he always did, one word, morning, no more, and then I heard nothing. A long nothing. Longer than it takes to pour coffee. I looked in through the window. He was standing where I'd stood, and he was looking at her cheek the way I'd looked at it, except a man's face when he's 60 and has buried a wife and a great deal else does not do what my face had done. Mine had flinched. His went still. Completely still, the way water goes still right before it freezes, that dead flat calm that isn't peace at all but the exact opposite of it held down hard. "Who?" he said. Same word I'd used, same stone. And Lupe gave him the same answer she'd given me. "You'll want your breakfast, Mr. Cole," and turned to the stove. And I watched Josiah Cole stand there in his own kitchen and receive that answer, and I watched him decide something. You couldn't have seen it if you didn't know him. There was no change in him a stranger could have named. But I'd worked 3 years for the man, and I saw the exact moment a decision went into him and set, like a fence post packed in wet ground that's going to dry hard as iron. He said, "Sit down, Lupe." I'd never heard him tell her to sit, in 3 years. She cooked and served and ate alone in the little room off the kitchen, and that was the order of the house, the order of the whole territory really, and he had just broken it in 3 words. She didn't move. He pulled a chair out from the table, his own chair, the head of it, and he said it again, gentler, "Sit down," and she sat slow, like a woman lowering herself onto ice she doesn't trust. He put a cup of coffee in front of her, poured it himself. His hands, I noticed, were not quite steady, and Josiah Cole's hands were the steadiest I ever knew. Then he said, "I'm not going to ask you a third time who did it. I know you won't tell me, and I understand why you won't, and I'll not shame you by making you refuse me again." He pulled out a second chair and sat down across from her, an old man and a bruised woman at a breakfast table, and he folded his hands. "But I'll find out, and when I do, I'll settle it, not with a gun. I want you to hear that from me plain, because I expect you've had men promise you settling before, and I expect it always meant somebody bleaking blood in a street and the trouble coming back on you twice as hard afterward." He paused. "It won't be that. I give you my word it won't be that, but it will be settled." She looked at him a long moment, and she said the thing I have never forgotten, the thing I wrote down word for word in my little book that same night, because I could not stand for it to go uncounted anywhere in the world. She said, "In this country, Mr. Cole, a man's word about protecting me has never once been worth more than the man's convenience." He didn't argue with her. That was the thing. A lesser man would have argued, would have puffed up and promised harder. Cole just nodded slow, like she'd said something true that he already knew and was ashamed to have made her say. "I know it," he said, "so I won't ask you to trust my word. I'll ask you to watch what I do." And he stood up, and he put his hat on, and he walked out past me on the porch without a word. And he went and saddled his own horse, though there were 4 of us who'd have done it for him, and he rode toward Sabino in the new day's light. I want to stop here and tell you what I did not know that morning, because you deserve to understand what Cole was riding into, and I only understood it myself in pieces over the days that followed, the way you understand any true thing late and against your will. Here is what I learned about how Lupe came to that kitchen. 3 years before, in the last hard stretch of the Troubles, there'd been a party of soldiers and a party of Apache and the ugly kind of business that happens between them. And in the middle of it, a woman had come walking into the Sabino country half dead, carrying a child that wasn't hers. The child's mother had died on the trail. The woman, Lupe, had kept it alive 4 days on nothing, walking, and she'd walked it right up to the edge of a white town because she'd run clean out of any other idea, knowing full well what a town like that might do to an Apache woman who came out of the desert. She'd done it anyway. That's the endurance I'd talk about if I were the sort to talk about human greatness, which I'm learning I'm not, because the word greatness is too clean for what it actually costs. She walked a dying baby to the doorstep of people who might have killed her for the trouble, because it was the baby's only chance, and her own safety she reckoned as worth less than that chance. That's not greatness. That's something with no good word for it. The town, to its small credit, took the baby. A childless couple named Das took it and raised it, and it's a grown girl now, and that's a different story. And the town, to its everlasting shame, would have turned Lupe back out into the desert the same afternoon. Some of them wanted worse, except that Josiah Cole happened to be in Sabino that day, and he'd stood in the street and watched the whole thing, and he'd said, in that quiet way of his that carried further than a shout, "The woman'll work for me." That was all. Nobody argued with Cole. And that's how it came to be that the town of Sabino carried 3 years of resentment for a mercy they'd been too cowardly to refuse. I didn't know all that on the morning of the marks, but I'd started to know a piece of it, because when Cole rode off I went back into the kitchen. I'd found some spine, or shame had found it for me, and I sat down where Cole had sat and I said, "Lupe, I don't know your right name. 3 years and I don't know it. And I'm ashamed of that this morning in a way I can't put down." And she looked at me, still with those 4 marks going purple in the light, and something in her face eased, just a hair, just a thread's width. "You couldn't say it," she said. "None of you could ever say it. Say it slow." So she did. She said it slow, and it was made of sounds my mouth wasn't built for, and I tried it and got it wrong, and she almost smiled and corrected me, and I got it closer, and I have decided not to write it here even now because it was hers, and I gave the town enough of her already by writing down the name we forced on her instead. But she told it to me, and in my little book that night on the left side, the side of what's owed to me, I wrote nothing. And on the right side, the side of my own debts, I wrote a single line, and the line was, "Her name, and 3 years I didn't ask for it." Some debts you can't pay. You write them down anyway. You write them down so that at least they're counted, so that at least in one small book in one shirt pocket in the whole indifferent territory, the sum is refusing to come out even, the way it never should. Now, the man who left the marks. I found out who it was before Cole did, as it happened, and I found out the way you find out everything in a small country, by the wrong person letting the wrong thing slip. His name was Vance Harmon, and if that last name is ringing in you, then you're quicker than the town gave itself credit for, because yes, Harmon, the same Harmon that half of Sabino had grieved for years, this Vance was his nephew, his blood. The living reminder the town treated as a kind of sacred thing. Poor grieving Vance, who'd lost his uncle to the Apache and had a right, folks felt, a right to his bitterness, a right nobody would ever question. Vance Harmon had come out to the Cole place the evening before to talk about cattle, some strayed head, some line fence business, and he'd come into the kitchen while Cole was still out at the tank, and he'd found himself alone in a room with an Apache woman, and something in him that had been curdling for years had spilled over. I never learned exactly what she said or didn't say. It doesn't signify. Nothing she could have said would have earned it. He'd struck her hard enough to sign his name, and he'd gone home to his supper, and I have no doubt at all that he'd slept fine, because in the account Vance Harmon kept in whatever passed for his soul, that blow didn't go down as a debt at all. It went down as a payment, as a small installment on a grief the whole town agreed he was owed. That was the thing Cole rode into Sabino to settle, not a stranger, not some drifter you could run off, the most protected man in the county, a slap that the entire town, if it ever came to light, would privately reckon as understandable, as maybe even just. I stood on that porch and watched him ride toward it, an old widower alone on a gray horse, and I thought, God forgive me, I thought, he can't. There's nothing he can do. The sum's already been decided by the whole town, and it's decided against her, and one old man can't rewrite what a whole town has agreed to feel. I was wrong about that, but I want to be honest that I didn't know I was wrong. That morning I'd have bet my wages and my little book and the shirt off my back that Josiah Cole was riding toward nothing but his own humiliation, and that by sundown he'd learn what the rest of us already knew, that in the Sabino country some debts don't come due, ever, because the ledger was rigged before any of us were born. He came back at dusk. I was at the corral. I watched him ride in slow, and I couldn't read a thing off him, and he didn't say a word to me, just handed me the gray to unsaddle, which he never did. But at the door of the house he stopped, and without turning around he said, to the evening, to me, to nobody, "It'll be Sunday. That's all. It'll be Sunday." And he went inside, and through the window I saw him take his hat off to a woman with a bruised face, take it clean off in his own house like she was gentry, and I did not understand one bit of what I'd just been told, and it was 3 days until I did. Sunday. He'd said it like a man, nomming the day a debt fell due. 3 days is a long time to wait for a thing you can't see the shape of. Cole said nothing more about it. That was his way, and I ought to have expected it, but I've never been good at waiting, and those 3 days near about hollowed me out. I'd catch myself standing in the middle of a chore with a bridle half-mended in my hands, staring at the road to Sabino like the answer might come riding up it. It didn't. What came instead was the ordinary work of a ranch, which does not stop for a man's justice or a woman's bruise, and there was a strange mercy in that. The cattle didn't know. The wind didn't know. The world went on being the world, and I mended the bridle, and I fed the stock, and I watched. Because Cole had told all of us, though only I'd been standing close enough to hear, watch what I do. And so I watched. Here is what I saw him do in those 3 days, and I'll set it down in order the way I set everything down, because the order is the whole thing. At the time, each piece seemed like nothing. It's only laid end to end that you see the man was building something. The first day, he rode into Sabino again and went to the church. Not on a Sunday. A Wednesday, empty, the doors open to air it out, and he sat with the preacher, a young man named Ephraim Toll who'd come out from back east 2 years prior with more conscience than sense, which in that country was a dangerous ratio. They talked a long while. I know because I trailed in on the excuse of buying nails, and I saw the two of them through the church door, Cole gray and still in the third pew and the young preacher leaning toward him, and I saw Toll's face change over the course of it, go from polite to troubled to something I'd call frightened if a man of God is allowed to be frightened of his own flock. Whatever Cole asked him for, it cost the young man something to say yes to. But he said yes. I saw him say it. I saw the nod. The second day, Cole did a thing that made no sense to me at all. He sent me into town with a message for the Das family, the couple that had taken in the baby Lupe carried out of the desert, 3 years gone. The message was an invitation. Would the Dasses and the girl come to church on Sunday? That was all. Josiah Cole requested the pleasure of their company at Sunday worship. Now the Dasses hadn't been to the Sabino church in near a year. There was a reason, and everybody knew the reason and nobody said it. The girl. She was 3, going on 4, and she was Apache, plain as the sun, and the town had been glad enough to save a baby but had never once figured out how to look at the child that baby became. The Dasses had stopped bringing her rather than watch the third pew and the fourth pew rearrange themselves subtly away from her. They loved that girl. You could see it in how the whole family had gone quiet and inward, the way people do when they're protecting something the world keeps trying to make them ashamed of. I gave them the invitation. I watched Mrs. Das read it. Cole had written it out, formal in his careful hand, and I watched her go pale, and then I watched her husband read it over her shoulder, and I watched something pass between the two of them, and Mrs. Das looked up at me and said, "Does he know what he's asking?" "Ma'am," I said, "I don't rightly know what he's asking. I only know Josiah Cole doesn't ask twice, and he doesn't ask for nothing." They talked it over most of the afternoon. I know because I waited, on Cole's instruction, bring back their answer, Elias, whatever it is, and along about 4 o'clock Mr. Das came out to where I was sitting on their fence and he said, "Tell Cole we'll come. God help us, tell him we'll be there." The third day, Cole settled his accounts. I mean that literally. He rode into Sabino and he paid every bill he had outstanding at the mercantile, at the smith, at the feed store, paid them clean, paid them ahead, till he didn't owe a soul in that town a red cent. I didn't understand it then. I understood it later, and when I did it near about broke me, because it was the most Josiah Cole thing he ever did. Before he called a debt due, He made sure he owed nothing himself. He wanted to stand in front of Sabino as a man who could not be answered with, "And what about your own account, Cole?" He was squaring his own ledger before he opened anybody else's. "I keep a book of debts. Sir, well, you know how I talk by now. I keep a book of debts, and I have never in my life thought to do that. To clear my own side clean before I asked another man to look at his. That old widower taught me something about justice in 3 days of doing chores that no preacher ever taught me from a pulpit. And here's the piece I've saved, because it's the one that tightened the whole thing like a cinch strap." On the evening of that third day, Vance Harmon came out to the Cole place again. I saw him coming from a good way off. A young man rides different than an old one, all urgency and no economy, and Vance rode like the country owed him a passage through it. He came up to the house and got down, and I moved to head him off, because whatever Cole was building, I didn't want it knocked over by this fool 3 days early. But Cole came out onto the porch before I reached them, and he said, mild as milk, "Evening, Vance." And Vance Harmon, who did not have the sense God gave a fence post, said, "Cole, I come to tell you you got a problem in your kitchen, and I'd take it kindly if you'd handle it, seeing as I already had to handle it myself the other night." He said it like that. Had to handle it. Standing in the yard of the man whose cook he'd struck, telling that man he'd done him a favor. I have thought a great deal in the years since about the particular blindness of a man who is so certain he's owed something that he'll walk right up to the person he's wronged and present the wrong as a service. It's not stupidity, quite. It's worse than stupidity. It's a soul that's been told its whole life that its grievances are sacred, until it can't tell the difference anymore between being hurt and being holy. Cole looked at him a long moment, and then he did the thing that told me, finally, that this was going to be worse and stranger and quieter than anything I'd imagined. He smiled. I'd worked for the man 3 years, and I could count on one hand the times I'd seen Josiah Cole smile, and none of the others had a thing in common with this one. This was a smile like the flat calm before weather. He said, "I'm obliged to you for telling me, Vance. It's a serious matter, a man's household not being in order. I mean to see it set right, and set right in front of everyone, so there's no misunderstanding about where things stand." He paused. "You'll be at church Sunday?" "Course I will." "Good," Cole said. "Come and see it settled then. I'd want you there particular, Vance. You more than anybody. It wouldn't be complete without you." And Vance Harmon, God, the blindness of him. Vance Harmon took that as his due. Took it as Cole agreeing with him. Took it as the promise of a public humbling of the Apache woman he'd struck, arranged for his personal satisfaction. And he grinned and got back on his horse, well pleased with himself, and rode off into the dusk to tell whoever he told his things to that old Cole had come around at last, had seen sense, was going to put the woman in her place come Sunday in front of the whole town. That was the story that went around Sabino those last 2 days. I know it did because I heard it come back to me twice, twisted a little more each time. Cole's finally going to deal with the squaw. That's how the town said it when it said it at all. They thought Sunday was going to be a public shamming. Some of them, God forgive them, were looking forward to it. It gave them a way to feel their old grief was finally going to be honored. 3 years of resentment about to be paid out in one satisfying afternoon. The whole town came to church that Sunday, fullest I ever saw it. They came for a shamming. I have to tell you now what I understood, standing in the back of that packed church on Sunday morning, and I have to tell you it was almost nothing. I knew more than the town. I knew Cole wasn't the man they thought. Knew the invitation to the Dosses meant something. Knew the smile he'd given Vance was a trap and not an agreement. But I didn't know the shape of it. I stood in the back with my hat in my hands and my little book in my breast pocket, sitting over my heart like a second, harder heart. And I watched the town file in bright-eyed for a cruelty. And I could not for the life of me see how one old man was going to turn that room. Because here's the arithmetic I'd done, sir, the cold arithmetic, and I want you to have it so the rest lands the way it landed on me. There were maybe 80 souls in that church. 79 of them had already decided how they felt. They decided years ago. The girl in the Das family's arms, the woman in Cole's kitchen, the whole question of whether an Apache was owed the same decency as anyone else. Sabino had settled all that a long time back in the dark, without a vote, and had built its comfort on top of the settling like a house on a grave. You do not undecide a whole town's grief in one Sunday. It's not possible. The sum's too big and it's been carried too long. I believed that. I want to be honest that I believed it right up until the moment Josiah Cole stood up. He hadn't been going to speak, that's the thing. It wasn't his church to preach in. He was a pew sitter, a layman, a quiet man who put money in the plate. But young Ephraim Toll got up to the pulpit and I saw the fear in him, the same fear I'd seen 3 days back. The fear of a man about to do a thing his whole congregation would hate him for. And instead of preaching, Toll said, in a voice that shook and then steadied, "This morning I've asked Brother Cole to say a word to us. I'd ask you to hear him out. All the way out, however hard it sits." And every eyebrow in that church went up, because Cole never spoke, and half the town figured this was it. This was the shamming beginning, the respected man rising to give voice to what they all felt. Cole stood. He didn't go to the pulpit. He just stood up in his pew, the third one, gray and lean, and he turned so he was facing the room instead of the front, facing all of them, and for a moment he didn't say anything at all. He just looked. Went pew by pew, face by face, unhurried, the way he looked over cattle at a sale. And the church got quiet, quiet in that wrong, weighted way I'd felt in the kitchen 3 mornings before. The quiet of a room that's just realized the floor is tilting, and only one man can feel it yet. Then he reached into his coat, and he took out a book. It was small, hand-sized, cover-worn soft, and I swear before God my heart stopped in my chest, because for one wild instant I thought it was mine, thought somehow he'd got into my things before I understood. Josiah Cole kept a book too, all those years. The steadiest, quietest, most closed-up man I ever knew, and he'd been keeping a tally the same as me in secret over his heart, and I never knew it, and I don't think anyone did. He opened it, and in the dead silent church, with the whole town leaned forward waiting for him to shame a woman, Josiah Cole said, "I've kept accounts my whole life. My father taught me. A man ought to know what he owes." He turned a page. His hands weren't quite steady. I saw it from the back of the church, that faint tremble in the steadiest hands I ever knew, and somehow that tremble was the loudest thing in the room. "I've been going back through mine this week, squaring it, and I've found I owe this town a debt I've been carrying 3 years, and I mean to pay it this morning in front of all of you, so it's witnessed and it's done." The town waited. Some of them, I could see it, were still smiling. They still thought this was going their way. They thought the debt he meant to pay was theirs, their grief, their harm, their 3 years of resentment. They thought Josiah Cole had finally come to settle accounts on their side of the book. They had it exactly backward, every one of them. And Cole, looking at that little book and not at any of their faces, said the first line of it. Just the first. And it was so far from what they were braced for that I heard 80 people stop breathing at once. He said, "3 years ago I stood in the street in this town, and I watched you decide to put a woman back out into the desert to die. And I stopped you. And I have let all of you believe every day since that I did it out of Christian mercy." He looked up then, right at them. "I didn't. I did it because I recognized her. And I've never told a living soul why, and this morning I'm going to, and when I'm done, this town is going to owe her something it can never in 100 years pay back, and it's going to start paying anyway. Today, with me first in line." He didn't raise his voice. I want that understood before anything else. Everything that came apart in that church over the next few minutes came apart at the volume of a man reading a grocery list. That was the terror of it. You expect a reckoning to sound like thunder. This one sounded like a bookkeeper, and it was worse than thunder could ever have been. "My wife died the second winter we were out here," Cole said. "Some of you are old enough to remember. Fever. I sat with her 8 days, and on the ninth she was gone, and I want to tell you what I never told anyone, which is that she didn't die alone with me. There was a woman came to the house, an Apache woman. She'd been trading eggs. This was before the troubles, before we all learned to hate each other so thorough. And she came to the door and saw the state of things, saw me half mad and useless. And she didn't have to do a single thing about it, and she came in anyway, and she nursed my wife those last 2 days. Cooled her. Sang to her low, in a tongue I didn't know. My Sarah died with a stranger's hand on her forehead because her husband had gone to pieces. And the stranger was an Apache woman, and I never even asked her name. The church was so still, I could hear the wind finding the gaps in the shingles. I never told any of you that, in 30 years, because it didn't fit. It didn't fit the story we all agreed on, that they were one thing and we were another, and the line between ran clean. That woman ruined the clean line for me, and I hid her. I hid what she did for my Sarah, because it was easier to grieve on the town's terms than to carry a mercy that made no sense. He turned a page in the little book, though I don't think he was reading any more. That's the first debt, 30 years old. A kindness I took and buried. Then he said, and here his voice did the only thing it did the whole time that you could call a break. It dropped, went quieter still, so that the whole church had to lean in, and there is no manipulation on earth like a strong man going quiet. 3 years ago I stood in the street and watched you all decide to turn out a woman who'd walked a dying baby across the desert. And when I looked at her face, he stopped. It was her, the same woman. Older, half-starved, 3 decades on, but I knew her the way you know a face that sat by your wife's deathbed. She'd come back into my life carrying somebody else's child to safety, and this town wanted to kill her for the inconvenience of it, and I stopped you, and I let you all call it my mercy. But it wasn't mercy. It was a debt. She saved something of mine once, and I finally, 30 years late, saved something of hers. And I have spent 3 years letting her cook in my kitchen and eat alone in a back room and be called by a name that isn't hers, because even after all that, I did not have the courage to make you look at what I knew. He closed the book. This week a man in this town struck her, left the marks of his hand on her face. He didn't look at Vance. He didn't have to. Every soul in that church knew in that instant, and I watched it move through the pews like a cold draft, the understanding of what Sunday actually was and how wrong they'd read it. And he did it certain that this town would call it justice. And you know the terrible thing, he wasn't wrong to think so. If it had come out any other way, most of you would have. That's the account I'm here to settle. Not his, ours. Now he looked at Vance Harmon. I was watching Vance the whole time, sir, and I saw the exact moment the ground opened under him. He'd come to that church for a triumph. He'd sat in the 4th pew grinning through the early part, sure the old man was building up to hand him his satisfaction. And somewhere around he did it certain this town would call it justice. The grin had died on his face like a lamp running out of oil, and what replaced it was the look of a man who has just realized he is standing, alone, in a room he thought was full of his friends. Vance, Cole said, and he said it almost kindly, which was the cruelest part. You struck her because you believed your grief entitled you to. Your uncle died in the troubles, and this town taught you that your loss was a coin you could spend on anybody with the wrong face. I'm not going to horsewhip you. I'm not going to run you out. I gave the woman my word there'd be no blood, and there won't be. He paused. I'm going to do something worse. I'm going to leave you standing exactly where you are in front of everyone you know, and I'm going to let them decide now this morning, with the truth finally in the room, whether what you did was justice or whether it was just a coward striking a woman who'd nursed a dying wife and carried a dying child. I'm not going to punish you, Vance. I'm going to stop protecting you. That's the whole of it. I'm just going to stop. And he sat down. That was the justice. That was the whole quiet, terrible thing. He sat down. There was no verdict, no mob, no rope, nothing the town could later tell itself a clean story about. Cole had done something far more merciless than punishment. He'd removed the one thing holding the wrongness in place, which was everybody's silent agreement to look away, and he'd done it by refusing, out loud in the third pew, to be part of the agreement any longer. He'd left them all standing in the light he'd let in, and there is no hiding a thing like that once it's lit. I watched Sabino sit with it. I'll not tell you the whole town was redeemed that morning, because that would be a lie and you'd smell it. Some of them hardened. I watched it happen, watched too. 3 men set their jaws and decide, right there, that they'd resent Cole forever for making them feel this, would sooner hate the man who showed them the wrong than face the wrong itself. That's real. That's how a lot of people take being shown a thing. I wrote their faces down later, in my book, on no side at all, because I didn't know yet what they owed or what they'd pay. But most of them couldn't hide from it. That was the thing about doing it in the open, all at once, with the child right there, because the Dosses had come, and the girl was in Mrs. Doss's lap, 3 years old and Apache, and looking around the church with the bright, unbothered eyes of a child who doesn't yet know she's supposed to be a problem. And you could not look at that little girl, sitting where Lupe had carried her to, and go on believing the clean-line story. Cole had arranged that. The invitation 3 days back. He'd known. He'd put the living proof of the mercy right in the middle of the room so the town would have to shame a child to keep its grievance, and Sabino, whatever else it was, could not quite do that. Not with her looking around like that. Not on a Sunday. Vance Harmon stood there a while longer. Nobody spoke to him. Nobody had to. And then he walked the whole length of that packed church alone, his boots the only sound in it, and not one hand reached out to him, and not one voice said his name, and the sacred grief he'd been living on his whole life turned to ash in the open air, and he felt it go. I saw him feel it. He was a smaller man going out that door than he'd been coming in, and no one had laid a finger on him. That was Cole's quiet justice. He'd let a man be exactly as small as he'd made himself, in front of everyone, with nothing to blame it on but the truth. I've thought about it 1,000 times since, whether that was mercy or the opposite. I still don't know. Some mornings I think leaving a man to his own smallness is the gentlest justice there is. Other mornings I think it's the one thing a soul can't recover from, and that Cole knew it and chose it on purpose, and that the old man had more iron in him than any horsewhip ever held. Both, probably. The truest things usually are. Here's what I know for certain because I saw it. When it was over, when Vance was gone and the church had let out its breath and young Toll was standing at the pulpit not knowing what a man says after that, Josiah Cole got up and walked down the aisle and out the door, and he didn't go to his horse. He went around the side to where Lupe was. Because she'd been there, not inside. She'd stood the whole time in the little vestibule by the side door where the coats hung, where she could hear and not be seen, because even Cole hadn't been able to ask her to sit in a pew. The town wasn't there yet, and he knew it, and he wouldn't make her the target of a thing that wasn't finished. So she'd listened to the whole of it through a doorway, the way she'd lived the whole of everything, through a doorway from the side unseen. And Cole came around and found her there, and he took his hat off. I've told you already how he did that in the kitchen, but this was in the daylight in front of whoever cared to look, and he said something to her I couldn't hear. Just the two of them, an old widower and a woman with the yellowing marks of a hand still on her face. And I don't know what he said. I've made my peace with not knowing. Some accounts aren't mine to read. But I saw her face while he said it. And I want to tell you it broke open with joy or forgiveness or relief, but it didn't do any of those clean things. What it did was harder to name and truer than all of them. It collapsed a little. The patience I'd seen in the kitchen, that terrible learned patience of a woman who'd never once been made better by a man's promise. It went out of her face for just a moment, and under it was something young and unguarded and unbearably tired. The face of a person who has braced against the world for so long that being met, finally, honestly, in the light, is almost more than the body can hold. She put her hand over her mouth. Her shoulders went. And Josiah Cole stood in front of her with his hat in his hands and let her, didn't reach for her, didn't hush her, just stood there and witnessed it, which was the one thing nobody in her whole life had done, stood still and let her be seen. That's where I'd end it, if I were the kind to end things neat. But you asked me for a true thing told slow, and true things don't tie off. So I'll tell you the rest, quick, the way it comes to me. The Dosses started bringing the girl to church again. Not to a warm welcome, to a divided one, half the pews softened and half hardened, exactly as they'd split that Sunday. That split is still there. Towns don't heal all at once. They heal the way a bad break heals, crooked, with a knot in it you can feel forever if you run your thumb along the bone. Lupe stayed in Cole's kitchen, but she ate at the table after that. At the head of it some nights when it was just the two old souls and me. And I learned to say her name, her real one, and I say it still, and I won't write it here. I've told you why. Vance Harmon left the country before the first snow. Nobody drove him out. He just couldn't stay in a place that had seen him made small, and I suppose that's a kind of sentence, to be unable to live where the truth about you is known. I don't know where he went. I didn't write it down. Some accounts you let go unfinished on purpose, because chasing them to the end would cost you more of yourself than the sum is worth. Cole died 4 years later in his own bed, and Lupe nursed him the last 8 days. I was there. She cooled him and she sang to him low in a tongue I didn't know, and I understood, watching it, that I was seeing the whole thing come round, the debt paid back to its very beginning, a mercy given a second time to close a circle that had opened 34 years before at another deathbed. He died with her hand on his forehead. I don't think he was afraid. I've never seen a man less afraid. I've still got the little book, both sides of it filling up all these years, what's owed to me and what I owe, and I keep thinking one day the sums will come out even and I'll be able to close it. They never do. I've made my peace with that too. I think maybe that's the whole lesson of the thing, the one Cole taught me without ever meaning to, that you don't keep the book so it'll balance. You keep it so that somewhere, in one small place in the whole indifferent country, the debts are counted, so that at least one person refused to look away. There's a line I've been meaning to write in it for years now, about Cole, about what he taught me a debt could be. I take the book out sometimes with the pencil ready, and I mean to set it down at last. I never do get the words to come. And I've started to think the not writing is the truest entry in the book.